Thank you, Joe. Thanks, everybody. I hope you can hear me in the back, because I prefer to just yell rather than be amplified. This is my topic today, risk-taking, inequality, and homicide. Everything I'm going to tell you today, where do I point this thing, or does it matter? Everything I'm going to tell you today is research conducted in collaboration with Margot Wilson. Let me give you a quick roadmap of where I'm going. First of all, I want to explain the first of these three nouns, risk-taking. I'm going to explain how social scientists have tried to make the concept of risk and risk-taking something measurable and operationalizable as outcome variance, and then talk about the question of why there is variability in risk-taking, or as people sometimes say, risk attitudes or risk propensity between individuals and between circumstances. I want to explain the links between inequality of outcomes, inequality of circumstances, and competitive risk-taking. And the punchline here is that inequitable outcomes inspire, or if you like, incentivize risky competitive tactics. And then we get to homicide. And basically, I'm going to try and persuade you that homicide rates actually are a pretty direct reflection of the local intensity of competitive risk-taking among men. And I'll show you evidence and cite other evidence that inequality is a great predictor of homicide rates. And that's what I hope to accomplish today. Economists, biologists, psychologists, people who call themselves decision theorists, they've pretty much all converged on essentially similar conception of risk as outcome variance. You know, if you have alternative policies, alternative courses of action, there's an expected value associated with a particular decision, perhaps, an average expected outcome. But there's also variability around that average expected outcome. And if two options present you with the same expected value, but different variances in payoffs, then the one with the higher variance is the riskier option. That's exactly what, for those few of you in the room who've amassed enough resources to actually encounter people like investment analysts, that's exactly what they're talking about when they try and assess your risk tolerance or taste for risk before laying their advice on you. Here's a simple operationalization of risk preferences or risky choice devised by a couple of experimental economists. Joyce Berg and Tom Reitz, a couple of American economists. Here's a problem which we've used in the lab quite a bit. You bring people into the lab, undergraduates like things that they actually get paid for, so they're pleased to participate in this sort of thing, and they pay attention. You say to people, pick a number between 1 and 100 ending in 5, i.e. 5, 15, 25, 35, up to 95, okay? Then you present them with, you know, like a fishbowl full of ping pong balls or poker chips or whatever, numbered 1 to 100. You say, draw one. And if it has a number higher than the number you chose, you win. How much you win depends on the number you chose. So if you pick a really low number, you have a really high probability of winning, but you don't win much money. If you pick a higher number, the probability that you'll win declines, but the amount you'll win increases. Now, people are confronted with this option just once. You know, you might think about, oh, if I walked into the lab and this was put in front of me and they're going to pay me afterwards if I win, what number would I pick? We show people this table, and this is complete information from a certain perspective, but of course we don't actually give people, and not everybody can compute, the expected values. There's the expected values of these different options. And you'll notice they're symmetrical around the middle. 45 and 55 have the highest expected value, and they're identical expected values. But 5 and 95 also have identical expected values, 23 3/4 cents on average. It's just that in this case, it's 1 chance in 20 of winning 475 and 19 chances in 20 of winning nothing. In this case, it's 19 chances in 20 of winning a quarter and 1 chance in 20 of winning nothing. And what I didn't put on this slide, but I should have given what I said about variance, is the variance in payoffs increases across this whole from lowest to highest. So, 5 and 95 have identical expected value, but the variance associated with this choice is like more than 300 times higher than the variance associated with this choice. And even these two, if you like, these two expected value maximizing options, you might say it's a bit of a wash between them, but this one has approximately 1.5 times the variance that this one has. So if you like, 45 is a safer expected value maximizing choice than 55. Okay, so we operationalize risk as outcome variance. Now, decision scientists commonly make this distinction. They distinguish risk from uncertainty. And the reason they do that is actually a pragmatic one. It's that you can do a precise optimality analysis of what choices people, quotes, should make if you have known payoffs and known payoff probabilities. But if there's uncertainty, then it's less clear. I mean, this is the reason why there's a venerable decision journal called the Journal of Risk and Uncertainty. Risk and uncertainty are different things in the minds of many decision theorists. And indeed, if you talk about decision making under uncertainty and you use the word risk, somebody is going to say, that's not risk, you're misusing the word. Just sort of dopey because you're using it like an English speaker instead of like a decision theorist. People also distinguish risk from danger. A risk has to be an outcome variance in a single currency. If you're talking about a risky choice in which, it's risky because, there might get a big payoff, but you might get hurt. No, that's not risk either. That's hazard or something. And again, the reason for that's pragmatic. It's an optimality analysis requires some sort of common payoff currency. People don't know what the hell to do with the quantitative analysis of the circumstance where people are opting for greater or lesser potential payoff and greater or lesser risk of injury is going along with it. They need a common payoff currency to make sense of it. To good Darwinians, as we all are in this bicentennial year, these distinctions are kind of artificial and dopey. In the real world, in the absence of sort of human-engineered games of chance, payoffs and probabilities are essentially never known precisely. And for that matter, the investment analyst wouldn't pretend they were either. Even in the modern artificial circumstance. Well, maybe some of them would, but they should be in jail. They're never known precisely, but natural selection and individual experience can both equip organisms with what you might call expectations, in quotes, with implicit expectations about payoffs and payoff probabilities that you would be selected to act in accordance with. And furthermore, the problem of payoff currency is kind of obviated by evolution-mindedness because ultimately, whether you're talking about calories or mating opportunities or risk of injury or death, and you're mixing them all together in the same analysis, it's expected fitness consequences that are the common currency that will lead to how natural selection acts on tendencies to respond. If you get me, I hope. Anyway, away from abstractions, back to, remember the little choice I showed you? Here are some data from McMaster students. 257 McMaster students given a chance to make that choice I showed you earlier, where you'll recall 5 is the safest, but the most you can win is a lousy quarter. 95 is the riskiest choice with the same expected value as 5. 45 and 55 are the expected value maximizing choices. And these are just the numbers of people, men and women, who chose each of these numbers. And you'll notice that women outnumber men down here in all the sort of low-risk choices, and then men outnumber women over here in all the high-risk choices. There's a sex difference. And it shakes out as a mean difference of this magnitude. In this data set, I mean, this was quite a remarkable result, and I wouldn't bet the family farm on it being replicable. But in this data set, if you just look at the expected value maximizing choices, even, if you said that's correct, people who've analyzed the situation properly should have chosen an expected value maximizing choice, but they've still got 2 options. Even if you just look at those, there's still a highly significant sex difference, with women preferring 45 and men preferring 55. So, as I say, that's fairly remarkable, and I wouldn't want to count on that kind of subtlety being replicable. But the phenomenon that men accept risk in financial and other domains to a higher degree than do women, and in some analyses even controlling for women and men of comparable means and so on, that's pretty robust. Sex differences in risky choice are pretty robust. Also, I won't show you the data, but in a subsequent experiment, Margot and I found that men's choices become riskier when there's an audience, when they have to announce their choices in public. And whether that audience is men, women, or mixed, all of them make men's choices riskier. It has absolutely no effect on women's choices, having an audience. They make the same choices as they would if they were alone. So that's a hint that maybe risky choice is somehow a display or at least socially facilitated in men. What's that all about? Why is there a sex difference? Okay, here's your evolution-minded spin on this. Here's the reason why somebody like me would have anticipated a sex difference in something like this. Darwinian selection, natural and sexual selection, that's, I say, largely a matter, somebody might argue entirely a matter, of differential reproduction among same-sex competitors. What I mean by that is within a population, males are engaged in a kind of zero-sum contest for the paternity of future generations. One guy's gain is another guy's loss. There's so much paternity to be carved up among all the males. And the females are engaged in a parallel contest over maternity. So far things sound similar, but in many species, including ancestral and, for that matter, modern Homo sapiens, males have a higher ceiling on potential fitness than females. You know, as witnessed the hoary old famous example of who's the guy who had the most kids, Moulay Ismail the bloodthirsty with his 888 kids. Who's the woman who had the most kids? Some astonishingly fecund Russian woman who had 69 through many multiple births, through 27 confinements that were all twins or triplets. But still, 888, as impressive as 69 as 888 is higher. And almost as a corollary of males having a higher ceiling on potential fitness, they're also more likely to die childless. Okay, never mind 888 and 69. These are sort of modern aberrations, but more selectively relevant circumstances throughout human evolution. It's going to be the case that for these reasons, intrasexual competition tends to be more intense among males than among females. And all I mean by this, really, it's almost a tautology. What I mean by intensity of competition is there's higher variance in outcomes among males. Illustrated by these data, or this boiling down of data into the fates of an average cohort of 100 males and 100 females in a natural fertility human population, the Kalahari-San, as studied by Nancy Howell from the University of Toronto. There's lifetime reproductive success of 100 newborn females and 100 newborn males. Even females, just over half of them will expect to die without producing a child, and that's largely due to the fact that there's very high death before maturity, and indeed death in the first couple of years of life. And then there's a distribution like this, and the maximum number of children produced by any woman is 9. And the central tendency among the survivors is 4 or 5. Among those who produce children at all is 4 or 5. Guys have a higher probability, 62% as opposed to 52%, of dying without issue. But if they have any kids, then it's skewed out a little farther, just a little farther in this society where polygynous marriage is rare but occurs. High-status guys occasionally have 2 wives simultaneously, more commonly monopolize the reproduction of a couple of women successively. So the mean number of offspring, this is very close, this is basically replacement level, a population growing very slowly. The mean number is slightly higher for women than for men because there are slightly more males born than females, and therefore the average number of offspring per newborn male has got to be lower than the average number per newborn female because of the sort of 51-49 sex ratio at birth, if you get me. But the variance, more importantly, is higher in males than in females. And that's what we mean by saying reproductive success variance is higher in males, the ceiling on reproduction is higher, the probability of dying childless is higher, and so males are in more intense competition than females for the resources for reproduction and the opportunity to reproduce. And as you probably all know, men tend to die off of just about everything at higher rates at all ages than females do, arguably because of the selective consequences of this. This is a slide that Margot and I generated from raw data and published many years ago from US data. This is the relative death rate of males divided by that of females. So if men and women at a given age, if males and females at a given age were dying of a given cause at the same per capita rate, or the same rate per 10,000 people, then the value here would be 1. Maybe drops to 1 out here in 90-year-olds on total mortality and disease-related mortality. But otherwise, every point in this figure is above 1. Males die of both so-called internal and external causes at all ages at higher rates than females. Interestingly, this difference, this is total mortality in the middle here. This difference is maximal in young adulthood, arguably when reproductive competition or the competition for future reproductive potential is most intense among young males. And it's much more extreme for so-called external mortality, accident, suicide, homicide. And this is mostly driven by accident, actually. It's a much bigger cause of death than suicide or homicide. It's much bigger for external mortality than for internal mortality. This is a typical pattern. The curves are smooth here because the US is a big country. I'll just show you some recent Canadian data. Whoops, what happened to the recent Canadian data? It's gone. They are gone. Okay, believe me. It looks the same, only a bit noisier because it's a smaller population. I didn't take that slide out. Nah, And we'll just get confused, or I'll just get even more confused. This is a robust kind of pattern. As I say, this pattern is driven here mostly by accidental death, but it also includes homicide, and I want to turn attention to talk about homicides. Here are data from 3 data sets that Margot and I amassed during our research careers. They may seem curiously arbitrary, 2 national-level data sets and 1 city-level data set. The reason there's a city-level data set here is, well, first of all, Chicago has more homicides every year than Canada or the UK, so it's a nice big N. But also, there are no national-level data of decent quality for the U.S. The U.S. has national-level data, and people analyze them all the time and publish things based on them, but they're terrible for a combination of reasons I could tell you about later that largely have to do with just sort of interagency squabbles in the U.S. and stuff like that. But there are good city-level data sets. The Chicago one is one that we helped amass by spending a lot of time in the Chicago Police Department going through all the cases. And these are based on all homicides known to police, which arguably, regardless of whether they were successfully prosecuted, all homicides known to police in which they were known to be cases in which either a man killed an unrelated man in the upper curve in each case, or a woman killed an unrelated woman in the lower curve in each case. These curves look remarkably similar, although if you notice the y-axes, there's something interesting going on here about homicide rates. These are homicides per million populace of that category, of that age-sex group per annum. So homicide rates in Canada are close to twice what they are in the UK. They are very much higher in the city of Chicago, and indeed in the US generally, although not as dramatically as this. But the sex difference and the age pattern is pretty darn robust. And I want to talk about these kinds of homicides. Guys killing unrelated guys, women killing unrelated women, mostly just guys killing unrelated guys is what I want to talk about. And there's a rationale for that focus. First of all, this is the majority of all homicides. In the US and Canada and the UK, almost everywhere. Not quite everywhere. It's also the most variable component of the homicide rate. That is to say, where homicide rates are high, there's a larger proportion of cases that involve men killing unrelated men. Where homicide rates are very low, like in some Western European countries, in the Netherlands, in Scandinavia, then it's those are the cases that drop out. And then you're left with a relatively high proportion of cases that would be spousal homicides or infanticides by teenage mothers, or these other sort of residual categories. So those cases start proportionately to look very prevalent in places where homicide rates are low. But it's not because they're more prevalent there. It's just because the male ones have dropped out completely. So if you want to understand variability in homicide rates, you want to understand variability in cases of men killing unrelated men. That's the component of the homicide rate that varies the most. And people do want to understand variability in homicide rates. I mean, one of the most interesting phenomena, I think, well, certainly the most interesting phenomenon to homicide researchers, but I think one of the most interesting phenomena in the social sciences really is the massive differences across nations, across places, in things like, violent death rates. We're not talking sort of 10 and 20 and 30% differentials. We're talking many-fold differentials across countries. What's that all about? So guys killing other guys who are not their relatives, which is the majority of all homicides, I want to persuade you that these are a manifestation of male-male competition. And the way I'm going to persuade you is mostly just by telling you so. If you spend a lot of time reading police investigative reports of homicides, as we've done, as other researchers have done in other places, you tend to find this, that the primary context in which men kill other men is some kind of social competition. The two parties are usually acquainted, although they might have been strangers at the beginning of the evening. There's often something like a status challenge. There's some sort of public insult. You know, somebody disses somebody else in a bar, or somehow insults the other guy in front of witnesses, very commonly witnesses who are acquainted with both of them. There's often rivalry over a woman, as is nicely illustrated in this woodcut by a contemporary Brazilian artist. Women. Look at the look on her face. But I digress. And I stress social competition because most of these cases, there doesn't appear to be any good material rationale. It's not, you know, it's not a robbery. It's not a money-based rivalry. They're fighting over what you might call intangible social resources of respect and status and hierarchical position and not being laughed at by mutual acquaintances. In the US, you got, until recently at least, about 20,000 homicides a year. Over 10,000 of them are of this kind. And I'm talking about all homicides, including the, you know, serial rapist killers and everybody else as victims. When the case is not of this sort, the second main context is robbery. And robbery you could think of as, you know, material competition as opposed to social competition. You got money, I want your money, I kill you, I got your money. It's you know, what could be more competitive than that? It's even more transparently competitive than the what criminologists used to call trivial altercation between acquainted men. Really lousy name because there's nothing trivial about it, except the ostensible triggering incident often. These are very dangerous ways to compete with other guys. Sticking them up, having knife fights with them. I mean, most of the guys in this room compete with other guys in you know, sort of gentler ways, right? You know, you badmouth them to women. You try and make them look stupid in certain social contexts where they're not likely to pull a knife, you hope. So, I mean, if competition among guys is ubiquitous, the interesting question, is what factors promote reckless risk-taking, dangerous use of dangerous tactics in competitive contexts. And getting back to the same vintage as the piece of music you were listening to when you came in, 60s music, my stuff. Actually, my stuff's 50s music, but this guy got the answer in a song some of you will remember. That's the answer. When you got nothing to lose. Who's going to be dangerous? It's the guy who's got nothing to lose by escalating his tactics. The guy who is on track for non-success if he doesn't escalate his tactics of social competition. So he's prepared to escalate his tactics of social competition. So, for example, being unemployed is a risk factor for homicide. Being unmarried is another one. I'll show you some data. Reckless risk-taking in competition in competitive contexts increases when competitors have relatively little to lose. Here are some data that Margot and I published many years ago rates at which men killed unrelated men in relation to the killer's age and employment status in the city of Detroit. We did our first homicide research in the city of Detroit, another city which has more homicides every year than the whole of Canada. It's handy. And at that time, the deputy chief of police in Detroit happened to have a PhD in sociology and thought that doing research from police archives was a good idea, which most deputy chiefs of police do not think. So we were delighted and got into the Detroit Police Department. And this may seem obvious. Unemployed guys are more likely to kill another unrelated guy than employed same-age guys at essentially all ages, except teenage years, and actually teenage is sort of an artifact, because what unemployed means here actually is still in school. So there's a big socioeconomic confound there, that, or class confound there. Well, there's a class confound everywhere, I guess, but I mean, the meaning of being employed versus unemployed is different here. Unemployed and or a student here, not subsequently. This was actually the first demonstration, believe it or not, that being unemployed is a risk factor for committing homicide. And you notice there's an age crime curve nonetheless. Unemployment status doesn't like explain away the age pattern, but it has a whacking great influence. Unemployed guys are more likely to get into the kind of altercations where somebody ends up dead, arguably because their circumstances are such that, you know, they perceive their life circumstances as entailing less to lose and more to gain by holding on to status, gaining status, competing in potentially dangerous ways. The other thing guys compete over, of course, is women. So we and other people have known for a long time that single men are more likely to kill than married men are of the same age. But it took a lot of data collection to be able to add to this the data for divorced men and for widowed men. And they're nastier than married men too. Now, you could say, you know, initially, if you see a single versus married effect, this ain't experimental science. This is something to think about for psychologists in the room. This is why psychologists do experiments. Experiments may strike you as, you know, sort of boring trivializations of interesting things sometimes. But what people like about experiments is you can control variables and assign people to groups and stuff like that. You measure the effects of a variable like marital status in the real world, and God knows what you're really measuring the effects of, because it's self-assigned and it's correlated with other things. A difference between single and married men could reflect not that being married pacifies guys, which is my preferred interpretation, but just that the kind of guys who can attract a woman are the kind of guys who are out there killing each other in bars, for example. And then, you know, even adding in the divorced, you could say, well, arguably the divorced are a selected subset of married men who are violent jerks. And again, it's not their singleness that's making them violent, it's their violence that's making them, you know, serially single. That's a tougher argument to make on the widowers, though. These guys did not get widowed by killing their wives. Widowed guys seem to snap back into single mode, too, in some sense, becoming more likely to go get in a knife fight in a bar than when they were married. Arguably, being married has a pacifying effect on men, and there's endocrinological data and other evidence that sort of is complementary to that. But I would say one, you know, the sort of functional interpretation is that guys who have a wife have something to lose by engaging in male-male competition in dangerous ways. Guys who are wifeless have less to lose and are in more desperate circumstances and are more willing to escalate their competitive tactics, arguably. Anyway, that's one class of circumstances that would presumably exacerbate reckless risk-taking in competitive contexts. Another is just when the outcome variance is high. Now, that was what I was arguing about, the concept of we measure risk as outcome variance. When payoff variance is high, there's something to compete over. When payoff variance is low, why are you going to pull a knife on another guy if you're a bunch of Scandinavians who the income differential between the lowest quartile and the top quartile is only twofold instead of the ninefold it is somewhere else. I mean, relatively equitable outcomes reduce the incentives for dangerous competition. And this is most clearly illustrated by these kind of data, where you get a standard economist's measure of income inequality, which I can explain to anybody if they want it later, but it's the so-called Gini index, named after an Italian economist named Gini. It's a measure of income inequality that is, in principle, potentially orthogonal to just income. And these are homicides per million persons per annum in 1990 in 50 US states and 10 Canadian provinces as a function of income inequality. And I think these data are really remarkable. We in Canada agonize all the time over, why we're different from the Yanks. What's the matter with those people south of the border? It's, the RCMP got west before the settlers, and that was different from the frontier mentality that infected the Americans. Or, I'm sure there's some truth to that. Gun ownership, blah, blah, blah. The valorization of, individual initiative in the U.S. and da-da-da-da. All of these things are fine, but it's sort of interesting that this single, simple, crude, and it is crude, economic index, eats up pretty much the between countries variability in homicide rates. It's also noteworthy that there's massive differences even within the US. I mean, again, I said homicide differences are interesting partly because they're so big. There's tenfold differences in homicide rates between the most peaceful and the most violent US states. We're not talking dinky little differences. We're talking big differences. And income inequality explains about half the variance. And this variable, by the way, has been found in various analyses by various people to be the best single predictor of cross-national variability in homicide rates as well. And finally, third thing that is likely to exacerbate reckless risk-taking is when the future's uncertain. What I'm thinking of here is, and there's lots of evidence for this sort of thing in non-human animals, if you're confronted with an environment in which extrinsic mortality is high, in which the likelihood that something will kill you, predators, disease, whatever, is cued for you as being high, independent of your actions, then selection is going to favor, in that circumstance, expending maximal reproductive effort in the short term, not having a long time horizon, competing intensely for reproductive opportunities, and so forth. Now, Margot had the brilliant idea a number of years ago that we should look at homicide in relation to, we should look whether homicide rates could be predicted by life expectancy net of the impacts of homicide. Of course, take homicide as a cause of death out of the analysis, and you say, are guys more likely to kill each other in contexts where life expectancy is low? And we did these analyses in the city of Chicago. And here are homicides per 100,000 persons per annum in 77 Chicago neighborhoods as a function of life expectancy. If there's a population biologist in the room, I apologize for using LX as a shorthand for life expectancy. I realize it's actually a term in the computation of life expectancy. I really should get that out of the figure, I suppose, but effective homicide has been removed from the calculation because that would be circular, where people are getting killed, their life expectancy is low, and life expectancy predictor of them getting killed, So you take homicide as a cause of death out. One of the things that's remarkable here, and that is essentially unknown in the US and should be getting a lot more attention, is the ridiculous range of life expectancies across neighborhoods in a major modern American city. I mean, it's disgraceful. In the best neighborhoods in Chicago, male life expectancy at birth is like 78 years, which is, Scandinavian values. In the worst neighborhoods, it's under 55 years, which, Zimbabwe is worse. I'm not sure there are any other contemporary countries that are worse on a national level. It's pretty shocking. And this is the strongest univariate relationship between any measured variable and homicide rates in a cross-sectional study that anybody's ever found anywhere. You're eating up almost 80% of the variance in homicide rates by life expectancy. Interestingly also, for the criminology aficionados in the audience, American criminologists have been very fond of talking about various variables that predict homicide rates in cities. And if you said to an American criminologist, okay, this eats up most of the variance, guess what the only variable we can find that significantly predicts residual variance is? That's a significant additional predictor of what's left to be explained. I think it's a safe bet that they would say, racial heterogeneity of the neighborhood, or percent black, or some fool thing. The answer is income inequality. That's the only variable that predicts any residual variance that we can find in this analysis. Well, think about these guys in these low life expectancy neighborhoods. They're seeing people killed. They're seeing, most of the difference here is due to partly to untreated disease. In the worst neighborhoods in Chicago, the hospitals have closed because they've gone bankrupt. They couldn't afford their emergency rooms, so they just shut down the hospitals. So people in the worst neighborhoods in Chicago don't have an emergency room to go to. So people die of the same injuries they might survive in better neighborhoods. And even more than that, there's a big difference in deaths from so-called internal causes, from disease. Again, it's largely a matter of untreated disease in the worst neighborhoods, and the same diseases are treated in better neighborhoods. But there's also probably worse circumstances of infection and so on in the worst neighborhoods. But anyway, if you grow up in one of these bad neighborhoods, you see that some people die. And what is the implication about how you should live your life? Investing in the future is kind of a mug's game. Income reliability is probably really low and might well be an additional predictive factor, actually, in these kinds of analyses if we could get good data on it. The extent to which whatever your income is now is predictive of you still having that a year hence is probably lower in the worst neighborhoods. But in any case, I mean, why not be a dangerous competitor? Why not live dangerously and in the short term? And gang ethnography tells you that that's the way gang members in urban environments think. They don't necessarily have an accurate apprehension of their life expectancy and their mortality risks, but they sure as hell have an apprehension that their life expectancy is low and they better get theirs now. And that's what the song you were listening to when you came in was about. It was this song, Born in Chicago, by the Paul Butterfield Blues Band, written by Nick Gravenites, member of that band. And that's the song that you were listening to. I was born in Chicago in 1941. My father told me, son, you better get a gun. And then, for those of you who are not native speakers of whatever language this is, that meant died. And the theme of the song is, I saw my friends die around me. And then the last verse is sort of interesting. I didn't get a chance to ask the guy who wrote the song exactly what he had in mind when he wrote it. But I read this, rules are all right if there's someone left to play the game. All my friends are going and things just don't seem the same, as kind of a declaration that living a rule-bound life makes sense when the social environment around me is a little bit stable, but it ain't. And the rules don't apply anymore. And arguably, that has a lot to do with why we see the violence we see in the worst neighborhoods of a city like Chicago. That's it.